Okay, let's take a look at the trouser sewing sample. I have an older version of the pattern here. Your version will be a little bit different. You'll have tailor's tacks at the darts on the front trouser sample. You'll also notice there's a line down here at the bottom of the front and back trouser samples, and it'll say on your pattern to cut here for shortened trousers. Do that. Make sure you're cutting along here, and on the back cutting along this line. It does not extend all the way through the seam allowances, but you will cut yours all the way through the seam allowances. This will give us some very short shorts, but if you do not cut at these corresponding lines, your inseams and out seams might not match properly. So make sure you're cutting along these lines. There is no hem allowance included in this. So I'm not placing a hem on my sample. I'm also not installing a waistband on my sample. So be aware of that. But you should have the front trouser sample with the slash taken out of it in preparation for our pocket, a 3/4 inch seam allowance along the top edge of the center front with a tailor's tack here. There will also be tailor's tacks here on the darts. Make sure to clip all of your notches and apply all your tailor's tacks, and make sure you're cutting a pair of those front trousers. Same thing here for the back trousers, making sure that we're indicating our tailor's tacks and clipping all of our notches and cutting here at the shortened hemline. Make sure there is a pair of the back trousers. You'll have the trouser pocket bag. You'll also cut a pair of these, as well as the pocket facing. You'll also cut a pair of these. You'll notice that there are some internal lines in these two patterns. You don't need to worry about that for our particular sample, but I will explain those a little bit later. Make sure we've got our notches clipped into our patterns again, cutting a pair, so a mirrored pair for each of those. We've got the zipper guard. You're going to cut one self, just like it says on the cutting instructions, and cut one interfacing of this. And the J-fly facing, one self and one interfacing. All of these patterns need to be cut face up. It will take about 1.5 yards to 2 yards of fabric to cut these sample pieces. I'm using muslin for my samples, and as you can see, I've cut them to my shortened hem down here. There is no hem allowance, but I've cut to that shortened hem. These are my back trousers, one pair with notches cut into them. Same for my front with the shortened hem. One pair with corresponding darts, tailor's tacks. My pocket facings, one pair. My pocket bags, also one corresponding pair with notches cut out. My zipper guard with interfacing, fusible interfacing applied to the wrong side. And my fly facing with tailor's tack and fusible interfacing applied to the back, to the wrong side. This is a total of 10 pattern pieces. 1, 2, 3, and 4, 5, and 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So this makes a total of 10 pattern pieces. So if you don't have 10 pattern pieces, check your cut instructions one more time. Along with these pieces cut from muslin or your fabric of choice, you'll also need a 7 to 9 inch long polyester or nylon coil zipper. Do not use a metal zipper for this sample. These polyester or nylon coil zippers are easy enough to cut with a regular pair of scissors. The brass and metal zippers that you see on denim, they have to be shortened through completely different means. Not something you can easily do with a pair of scissors. So please use a 7 to 9 inch long polyester or nylon coil zipper. Do not use an invisible zipper. This technique for making a J-fly will not work with an invisible zipper. So we need that. This is a 9-inch zipper that I have. You can always use a zipper that's longer than what we need. We have, this particular pattern is measured to 7 inches at this tailor's tack. From the waist point to this tailor's tack is 7 inches. So a 7-inch zipper will work, but 9 inches works just as well. You could use a 24-inch zipper if you wanted to. You can always shorten it. You can't lengthen these zippers. You will need a few different presser feet. If you are working from home, you'll need a standard presser foot, which will more than likely look something like this. If you're using a typical domestic home machine, you'll need a regular presser foot. You'll also need the narrow or zipper foot for your home machine. It should look something like this. If you're working on the industrial Jukies, you'll need a standard presser foot, which will probably look like this. They should already be installed on the machines. Yours might have a finger guard, mine does not. And you will need a narrow presser foot, sometimes referred to as a split hinged foot or a zipper foot. So make sure you have these feet, and make sure you have, if you're working on the industrial machines, have a screwdriver handy so you can change so you can change those feet. Okay, I'm going to start by sewing my darts. You should have the darts marked on your patterns. This will become the wrong side of my pattern. I have marked everything with a Friction brand pen, so once everything is pressed, you won't see any of these marks. But I'm going to sew all 4 sets of darts on my fronts and my backs. Press all of the dart excess towards the center of the body. If you're unsure of which direction is the center, look for your side seams. Your side seams will be slightly curved. And when you're looking at trousers, your center will always have this crotch curve in it. So this is my center front on both of these pieces. This is my center back on both of these pieces. Always look for that crotch curve. That will always go toward the center of the body. So I'm going to sew my darts and press all my dart excess towards the center. Okay, I've sewn my backs and front darts. So here are my 2 back pieces. Again, my dart excess is pressed towards the center back where that crotch curve is. So those are my 2 backs. And my 2 fronts. Again, dart excess pressed towards the center front where my crotch curve is. I'm going to turn these front pieces right side up so that I don't see my dart excess. We have this 3/4 inch seam allowance. So we basically have a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around with a 1/4 inch extension added. So for women's wear, I want to look at this particular pattern. This is on my left. This would be the wearer's right. This side is going to overlap this other side. So I'm going to take this pattern on my left. It has the crotch curve going towards my right. I'm actually going to set this one aside for right now. And I want to work exclusively with this one. So again, with your pattern piece, right side facing up, you should not see your dart excess. It should be nice and clean finished. We're going to work with this particular piece that has the crotch curve going out towards my right. I'm going to copy my tailor's tack using my Friction pen to the opposite side so I don't lose it. And I'm going to do a few things. First, I'm going to mark my center front line. I know I have a 3/4 inch seam allowance, so I can measure 3/4 of an inch in from that cut edge and mark my center front line. There is also a notch up here so I can ensure that I am on the center front line. So I'm just going to mark my center front line so I know where it is. I'm also going to measure in this 1/4 inch from this raw edge, and I'm going to trim this extension. The reason we add it is for later on when we attach our guard, but we only need it on the one side of the pant that is going to actually have the guard attached. The guard will only sew to one side of the pant. So again, this particular piece, I'm going to trim this 1/4 inch extension off. The opposite front piece, I'm going to leave this attached. So make sure you're only trimming this one on my left. I'm going to trim this 1/4 inch away. This would be the opposite if you were doing menswear. If you were sewing a pair of menswear trousers, you would trim the excess off of this one, the one on my right, or your right, and leave this one with the extension. So, my fronts are taken care of. I know where my tailor's tacks are. I'm just going to copy this over to here just to make sure I don't lose it. Our backs are sewn, so those are ready to go. Before I start assembly, there's one more thing I want to finalize. If you wish, you can serge the raw edges along the crotch curve, the inseam, and the outseam. You can do so on this back piece. You can serge those if you wish. You can serge them after it's sewn. I do not recommend serging your front. You can serge the back to begin with, but a lot is going to happen on our front pieces. I would not serge that just yet. I am, however, going to take care of my fly facing and my guard. The guard is just a rectangle. It doesn't matter what the orientation is as long as we keep it vertical. I've got the right side facing up. The wrong side has my fusible interfacing. I'm going to take right sides and fold them together along my notches. These two notches indicate the fold line for my guard. I'm going to fold this right sides together. It doesn't have to be pressed or anything. I'm just going to finger press it for right now. And whichever side you wish, I'm going to start with this side up here because it's readily available. I'm going to pin this together. So again, my guard folding vertically along those notches, right sides together. I'm going to pin one of these short ends and sew at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So here's my guard, right sides folded together, stitched along one short edge at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. The other ends are wide open. Only need this little edge here. I'm going to trim my seam allowance to a 1/4 inch. And I'm going to clip the notch, clip my corner, excuse me. I'm going to clip my corner along the folded side. I'm not worried about this side that's open. I'm looking at my folded edge. I'm going to clip that corner to reduce bulk. And then I'm going to go to my iron. At the iron, I'm going to take my tailor's point and my sewn zipper guard. I'm going to place the point at that corner that I just clipped and press open this tiny 1/4 inch seam allowance. Set aside my tailor's point, and I'm going to turn my guard right side out. So turning that seam allowance to the inside. I'm going to use my awl to point that corner out, push that out a little bit. There we go. Nice and clean finished. I'm going to make sure my raw edges on my guard are lined up, and I will press this right sides out. So that is it for my guard. The top should remain open and accessible. You should have the folded edge along one side, a stitched edge along the other side, and this long edge should be open as well. So these should be open and accessible. That is the guard finished. That's the guard sewn. And here is my fly facing. So what I want to do is clean finish these two pieces, my zipper guard and my fly facing. I'm going to go ahead and finish off some of the edges on these using my serger. You are welcome to top stitch it, turn and stitch it if you don't have access to a serger. You can also bias bind the edges if you wish. It's important that we make note of which edges to finish. On the zipper guard, here is my opened edge here, my folded edge, and my stitched edge down here. I'm going to serge along this long edge. So I've got the folded side, the long edge opposite to that. I'll serge this all together. You can use a 3-cone serge stitch to finish this edge off. You can leave this top edge open. The J-fly, when you're looking at the tailor's tack down here, we want to clean finish this curved edge all the way up to the top. Leave this top edge as it is, leave this edge as it is. This becomes our seam allowance to attach to our pant, but this edge here will get serged all the way around. So the first thing I want to do is put my two fronts, again, right sides are facing up. You should not see any dart excess. I'm going to put my two fronts together, right sides together. So I'm going to put one over the other, right sides together, and I'm going to pin this section of my crotch seam. I'm going to start by sewing a section of my crotch seam. I'm going to align my tailor's tacks and pin those together, and I'll sew about 2 inches of this crotch seam. I'm not going to go all the way to the inseam. I'm going to start at my tailor's tack, and go about 2 inches down. So I'm going to pin this in place. Again, we have different seam allowances up here, so it's important that we use those tailor's tacks to make sure we're lining things up properly. And I'm going to line up this 1/2 inch seam allowance here around my crotch curve and put a few pins into here. And I'll take this to the sewing machine, starting right on my tailor's tack and sewing about 2 inches along that crotch curve. Okay, at my sewing machine, get my threads out of the way. I'm going to lower my needle directly at this tailor's tack where my pin is. I'm going to hold my fabric in place, carefully remove my pin, and lower my needle right into that tailor's tack. I'm going to lower my presser foot and take a few stitches, about 2 to 3 stitches. I'm walking my stitches, and then I'm going to back tack. Okay, now that I've back tack, I'm going to go ahead and sew my 2 inches along my crotch curve. You can back tack at the end of this stitching. It doesn't really matter because we're going to end up continuing this seam later on. Now it's very important that we reinforce the stitching right here at our tailor's tack. Back tacking is a really good way to ensure that it's not going to come loose, but I also like to pull my threads to one side in order to tie them into knots. That's going to make sure that it's very, very secure. So I'm just going to I'm going to go to the back side of my sample here and pull on my bobbin thread, and I should see a loop of thread come loose from the front side of my garment where I was stitching. I can stick a pin or something in there to grab this loop and pull it all the way through. You'll now find you've got both threads, top and bottom thread, on one side of the garment, one side of the seam. And I'll tie this into a couple of square knots to make sure that it doesn't come loose. Because if this stitching comes loose at this point at the tailor's tack, we end up with a hole in our pants. On actual garments, you would probably want to take smaller stitches, a size 2.5 or a size 1 stitch, and back tack it just to make sure it's nice and secure. But for this sample, I'm just going to tie a few knots and then leave a couple of thread tails so it doesn't come loose. So if I open up this seam, it should be pretty secure, pretty snug in there. So back at the work table, there's the stitching I just completed on my sewing machine. If I open this back up, you're going to see that we've got the start to our crotch seam sewn. But now we've got this big gap in the middle at the center front where we need to put our zipper. Just to make my life a little bit easier, I'm going to use my friction pen and my ruler to mark my center front line on this side. I still have it marked from where I trimmed my seam allowance on this side, but I'm going to copy it over to this side again using my notches and the fact that I know there's a 3/4 inch seam allowance. I'm just going to measure 3/4 inch in from the raw edge, and it should stop at that tailor's tack. Okay, now it's time to install our zipper. I'm going to take my zipper. You can tell the right side of the zipper, the coils will be jutting out towards you, and you'll see the head of the zipper with the pull tab. This is the wrong side of your zipper. You won't be able to see the pull tab, and it'll be nice and flat on this side. I'm going to take the wrong side. I'm going to actually take my zipper and flip it right side down, because I'm now going to sew this right sides together. So the right side of my zipper with the right side of my fabric, put those two together. To make my life a little easier, I'm going to pull my pull tab all the way down and open my zipper up. Again, the right side of my zipper should be facing the right side of my fabric, so I shouldn't see any coils or anything here. I should not be able to see my pull tab. I'm going to take the bottom of my zipper. You should see a few little metal prongs down here. That's where the stop for your zipper is. You can open up the bottom of the zipper and see where the zipper stops. I'm going to place this point right here on my tailor's tack. So I'm going to line this up. I want the tape of my zipper going towards the raw edge of my pant, and this other tape going off to my right, aligning the bottom of my zipper tape with my tailor's tack. Pull my pull tab just a little so I can align that properly. And I want to align, this is where it gets tricky, because we now have a zipper tape that's shorter than our seam allowance. We have a 1/2 inch zipper tape and a 3/4 inch seam allowance. So I'm going to use the center front line that I just marked for myself as my guide. And I'm going to line up the teeth of my zipper along that center front, and I'm going to pin that in place. If it helps, you can also measure a 1/4 inch seam allowance here, so you have a guideline for the opposite side of your zipper tape. So my zipper teeth, right sides down, facing the right side of my fabric, lined up along my center front guideline that I gave myself, pinned in place. And you can see my zipper is extending beyond the top of my pant. It's because my zipper is 9 inches long and the pant is designed for a 7-inch zipper, but I can always clip this. I can always cut this at the top. At the bottom, however, this is where my guideline needs to go. I need to make sure that the bottom of my zipper tape lines up with my tailor's tack. There's my tailor's tack hiding in there. My zipper tape needs to line up with that. I actually need to lower the zipper just a little bit to make sure that lines up a little bit better. And once I'm satisfied with the position of my zipper, I'm going to hand baste it in place so it doesn't go anywhere. I can be confident that it's going to stay in one place when I go to sew it on the machine. Okay, so I've basted my zipper in place. Again, I've got the coils lined up along my center front marking. Got the edge of the zipper tape going towards the raw edge of the trouser. Got the other zipper tape extending over to my right. I've got the bottom of my zipper matching up with the tailor's tack on my garment. I want to avoid getting my seam allowance from the other side of my pant caught in any of my stitching. You should just have the seam allowance and the zipper tape from the right side of the rightmost pattern. I'm going to take this to my sewing machine and I'm going to sew with my zipper foot. So this is a time to change the foot on your machine. I'm going to sew with my zipper foot, and I'm going to sew right up along the edge of my zipper teeth. You'll feel as you sew, your presser foot is only going to get so close to the zipper teeth. So I'm going to get relatively close to my zipper teeth. I want to make sure that as I get down here to the bottom, that I pull my excess seam allowance out of the way. We don't want to catch this seam allowance in my hand. We're gonna stitch this down to just the seam allowance on this side of the pant. Changing out my zipper foot, and I know that when I go to sew this, I'll sew from the top of my zipper down to my crotch. So I want to be able to get my zipper foot as close to this edge as possible. So I'm going to install my foot this way. If you're using the narrow or split hinged foot on one of the industrial Juki machines, there's only one way to install it, so don't worry about which side. But if you're working from home, you want the excess of your foot extending out to the left-hand side so you can get as close to the right-hand side of your zipper as possible. Again, as I get near the bottom of the zipper, I'm getting to my zipper head here. I'm going to put my needle down into my work so it doesn't move. I'm going to make sure that the other side of my pant, this seam allowance here, doesn't get in the way. I'm going to push that over to the right so it doesn't get in the way of the needle. I'm going to lift my presser foot with my needle still down and start to close my zipper up. I should be able to get that zipper head out of my way. I'm going to push this past the zipper. There we go. So I've closed it up. My zipper head is all the way back here now. You should be able to lift your foot enough to get the zipper head pushed back, and now I don't have to worry about it being down here in my way while I'm sewing. I'm going to put my presser foot back down, make sure the other pant leg seam allowance doesn't get in my way. I'm going to hold that over to the right. I'm just going to stitch through this leftmost zipper tape. Again, staying close to the zipper teeth. Okay. Should be able to go a little bit further. And back tack 2 stitches to reinforce my stitch. So there is my seam. Here are my zippered teeth over on the right hand side. There's my seam right next to it, all the way down the zipper, extending into the seam allowance. And I did not catch this other seam allowance over here. There we go. You don't want to catch this seam allowance here. So you should be able to turn your zipper to the right side. You should be able to see the zipper coils. We shouldn't have any stitching or anything through the coils. If something has happened, rip the stitching out, do it one more time. You've got the hand basting stitches to keep everything in place for you. If we had just pinned this and sewn it and something went wrong, I'd have to repin it and over and yada, yada, yada. But now I've got the basting stitches to help me out. If something goes wrong, I can rip out my machine stitches and I still have the basting stitches as a backup, so I don't have to repin. While I'm here at the machine, I'm gonna go to the next step. So I've got my initial line of stitching done. I'm going to turn my zipper right side up so that I can see my fabric. I'm going to close my zipper just for simplicity's sake, just to get the head of the zipper out of the way. And as I pull my fabric back, you should start to see your center front line. This had originally been sitting right in the center of the zipper, but now we've added our stitching, it's going to pull away. So now you should see that center front guideline over there on the right hand side. I'm going to pull this rather taut, not too tight, and do a bit of a finger press along here. And I'm going to top stitch right along this fold of my fabric, still using my narrow zipper foot. I might switch the sides and the orientation of it. And as I get down here near the bottom and I top stitch along this folded edge, again, I'm going to move this seam allowance out of my way and just continue top stitching down this tiny little corridor here. So top stitching about 1/16 of an inch away from that folded edge. This may start to look somewhat familiar. This is a similar sewing technique, similar to the lapped zipper. I'll start from the bottom up because I don't feel like switching my foot around. Well, no. No, I'll switch my foot. Okay, so there's my zipper. Here's my fabric. I'm gonna switch my foot to the other side because now I want to be able to get as close to this edge as I can. I'll move my threads out of my way. Kind of tug on my fabric. This is a good use for your split hinge foot. You can use a finishing foot if you have a finishing foot for the industrial machines. And I'm going to top stitch along this edge. Close to the end here. I'm gonna grab this seam allowance, get that tucked out of the way, make sure I'm not catching my pant or anything underneath here. I'm just gonna give it a bit of a tug and get that seam allowance out of the way. I should have a little bit of a fold right here, and I'm just gonna kind of take my top stitching down into this area. I want to go past where my original crotch seam was, just to make sure it's nice and clean finished. Back tack a few stitches, about 2 stitches. And now I've got my top stitching to the right of my zipper tape. All the way along the edge there. And as I got down into my crotch curve, I pulled this seam allowance out of the way so that I was just stitching along that fold there. There we go. Pulled that out of the way. You can see where my seam was there. Don't want to catch that. Just right up along that edge. You can flip it over and you can see 2 lines of stitching on the back of my zipper. One is the original line of stitching we did, and the second one is that top stitching we just finished. I'm going to take this to the iron really briefly, just to iron away some of my friction pen marks. Okay, so here's the first part of the J-Fly installed. We've got the zipper and our top stitching. Again, the top stitching should descend past our crotch stitching, because otherwise we'd have top stitching that would just kind of stop somewhere in the middle here. We want to make sure it goes down past that crotch seam that we made first. Okay. That's the first part of our zipper done. So you can see what the back looks like. There's my dart excess. There's my 2 lines of stitching and my basting stitches. I'm gonna leave those in, and here's my 1/4 inch extension hanging out over here. Let's flip it back to the right side. And the next piece I want to get is my fly facing. So this edge has our zipper. We've taken care of that. We don't have any of the seam allowance out on the outside. It's all underneath now. But I've got a raw edge here that I need to finish, hence my facing, which is why it's the exact opposite to the crotch curve that we have on this particular piece. So I can take my facing, right sides together, and line this up along the raw edge of my trouser crotch curve. I'm going to line up these raw edges and pin this in place. And again, when we go to sew this, we're going to sew all the way down into here, and we're going to end up stopping at this tailor's tack. So we're essentially sewing the right side of the garment from the tailor's tack down, and we're sewing the facing for the left side of the garment from the tailor's tack up. But we also have a bit of an extension down here so that we don't come to a raw edge when we sew that tailor's tack down. So I'm going to pin this as best I can, raw edges matching. And I know where my tailor's tack is. We have to be very slow, very diligent when we sew this. If you want to, you can start your stitching from the tailor's tack and work your way up. I think that's what I'm going to do, because coming down in this direction, there's a lot of bulk here with the zipper and seam allowances and whatnot, and there might be a lot to push out of the way on the sewing machine, especially if you're sewing at home. If you're sewing on the machines if you're sewing on an industrial machine, it wouldn't be too much of a problem. You can see my 2 matching tailor's tacks. Here's the tailor's tack on my facing, and the tailor's tacks meeting there on my garment. I want to make sure those get closed together. So I'm going to take this to the machine and sew this together. I'm going to switch back to my regular presser foot. If you feel comfortable working with the narrow foot or the zipper foot, you're more than welcome to keep using it. But I'm going to use my regular presser foot. As I mentioned, I'm going to start from the bottom of my seam down here where my tailor's tack is. Lowering my needle right into that tailor's tack, and before I lower my presser foot, I'm going to check underneath to make sure I'm just going through my facing and my pant. I'm not catching the zipper, I'm not catching any other seam allowance under there. I'm going to lower my foot, I'm going to take a few stitches and back tack. Again, we want to make sure this stitching is very secure. Stitch my way up towards my waistband. This is a 1/2 inch seam allowance. If you don't have your fly facing marked like I had mine, you can sew it in this direction from the waist down and use the guides on your machine to get a 1/2 inch seam allowance. But down here, this is where my tailor's tacks was. And if I lift this up, those didn't align at all. So I've got a mistake here. You can see my tailor's tack is way over here and this one's stitched over here, so I'm gonna have to redo that. I'm gonna have to rip that out and redo that. Just gonna overlap my stitches. I'm gonna try this one more time. I'm stitching in the stitching from the waistband down this time. I'll see if that gives me a better finish. I just have to be very careful when I get down here to where the zipper is that I keep my edges aligned. I'm gonna move really slowly as I get into here. I don't want to catch any of this. I don't want to catch any of my zipper. But I do want to get to that tailor's tack. Lift up, make sure that they're still meeting each other. I can see there's my tailor's tack. It's still getting there, so that's good. Take a couple of stitches. Check one more time, lift my foot, see if they're there. Okay, a few more. Yeah, that's pretty close. I'm gonna take a tiny little, tiny bit of a stitch. Much better. And I will back tack. Okay. I'm gonna leave some tails on my thread. So there's where I repaired my stitching. Everything was fine up until there. So I redid that stitching. It's ending like right at that tailor's tack. And if I lift this up, you can see everything's kind of converging at that tailor's tack. It's okay if it doesn't come directly into there because we're gonna pull everything back and everything's gonna get top stitched. But I just want to make sure I didn't catch this or my zipper in that seam there. You can also take these threads and put them through a needle. So these tails of thread, you can put this through a needle and you can take some tiny little stitches here if you want to get it a little bit closer than the machine would get to. Again, like we did before, I'm going to tug on my thread here and pull up the loop that comes behind it. Trying to focus on there. Tug on this thread, pull up this little loop that comes with it to pull both of my thread tails to one side. And I'll tie a couple of square knots between these two tails so that this doesn't come loose either. And I'll just leave some tails. It's my serge stitching coming loose. And I'll trim these tails where I mended my seam. So we have the zipper installed on one side, we've got the facing installed on the other. Here we've got the zipper installed to the right side of the right side pattern, and the facing that I just installed on the left side, ending at the tailor's tack. I'm going to press this seam open using my tailor's board. my tailor's point and my tailor's board. Just quickly press this seam open. Okay. And then I'm going to take my facing, I'm going to tuck it behind my zipper. So my zipper is now sitting in front of it, just so it's nice and flat. Push my facing out towards my right. And I'm going to take all my seam allowance that I just pressed open and press it all towards my facing. Just going to get my zipper out of the way. Tucking the zipper up and out of the way. Press all that seam allowance towards the facing. I'm only going to get so far. Once we get past the tailor's tack, I'm not really going to be able to press much. But I just want that all pressed towards my facing. So that's nice and finished. And if I flip it over, you'll see all the seam allowances going towards the facing. And now I'm going to understitch right along here so that my facing doesn't fly out. So I'm going to understitch a 1/16 of an inch from the seam's edge along the facing. So I'm going to sew the facing and both seam allowances together. I'm starting from the waist edge, and I'm just going to do my best. Now on the Juki industrial machines, you can utilize the narrower presser feet to help guide your placement of your understitching. With this, I'm just going to do my best to keep my stitching aligned to my seam. As I get down here where everything's bunching up, I'm going to make sure my zipper stays out of my way, and I just want to make sure that I'm sewing through my facing and that line of seam allowance that's sitting underneath here. We're going to go as far as we can. I'm not going to be able to get far past my tailor's tack, but get as far as I can. And a couple of back stitches to secure that. So there is my understitching. Again, it's stitched through both seam allowances and my facing. If you wish, you can trim the seam allowance down, but for sample making purposes, I'm just going to leave the seam allowance intact. Back at the iron, got my zipper, got my facing. Gonna tuck my facing to the inside of the garment, and I'm gonna press this seam allowance, press it nice and flat. We're almost there. I'm gonna take my finished seam here. I'm gonna lay it on top of the other, covering my top stitching on my zipper. And I'm going to hand baste this together. We want to make sure that we hand baste this so we get the proper placement. So there's my zipper with my top stitching on my zipper. There's my understitching on my facing. My facing is pressed towards the inside of the garment. And I'm going to lay the faced side, the side with the facing, on top of my zipper. I should be able to align this top edge with my notch. We want to cover that stitching, and if you're using thread that's the same color as your fabric, you don't have to worry quite as much about that. And then I'm going to whip stitch from down here where my crotch seam starts all the way up into my waistline. I'm not sewing through the zipper, I'm just picking up the fabric, the muslin of the trouser sample. But I am taking relatively small stitches. So you whip stitch, picking up one side, extending the needle through the opposite side. Taking a few securing stitches here at the top. There we go. Whip stitched, base stitched all the way up. This will help secure my center front seam temporarily. I can now, holding this down, I can lift up the left-hand side of my pant, and I'll find my facing underneath here, and under that will be the other side of my zipper. I'm going to pin my facing to my zipper underneath. I just want to make sure, again, from the front where you've basted, I can now lift up the left-hand side of the garment. You'll find the facing underneath and the zipper, the other side of the zipper tape underneath that. I'm going to pinch the two together and pin them, pinning through the facing and my zipper underneath. So there it is, pinned through my facing, and it's pinned into my zipper underneath. From here, we're going to sew these together. Now you can hand base these in place to make sure this is not going anywhere. If you feel comfortable sewing from this side, you can keep an eye on where your zipper tape is, and you can stitch right down the edge. I'm going to switch back to my narrow zipper foot on my machine so I can get into this area a little bit better than I can with my standard presser foot. If need be, you can flip it over, keeping everything pinned, and you can stitch right along this side here. So you can stitch from either side, whichever you're most comfortable with. Switching back to my narrow zipper foot. I would like to sew from the zipper side up, so I'm going to reinsert some pins on this side so they're easier to remove while I'm sewing. Alright, I've got those repositioned. Again, it's pinned just through my facing and my zipper tape. And it does not really matter where you're stitching. You don't want to get too close to the zipper teeth as long as you're stitching this zipper tape down. I tend to stitch like right in the center of the zipper tape, about a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Again, back tacking at the beginning and the end just to secure the stitching. Here's the other side of the zipper tape stitched onto the facing. You may or may not catch some of the seam allowance under here. If you trimmed your seam allowance, you're definitely not going to catch it, but that's okay. And from the front, again, baste it together. Very unassuming center front finish. Really wouldn't even know that there was a zipper if it wasn't hanging out up here. Now comes the final part of the J-fly, is actually sewing the J, the top stitched J, into place. But we need to mark where that J is going, and there are a couple of ways to do that. I'm going to use my friction pen. You absolutely want to mark this. You don't want to eyeball this when you go to sew it. You're going to need to use a friction pen or chalk or hand basting stitches, something that you can clearly see on your fabric, depending on what kind of fabric you're using. Now, there are a few options for doing this. You can sketch it out. You should be able, if you're using muslin, you might be able to see your J-fly facing underneath there, so you can utilize that to your advantage and use that to create your curve, your J-fly curve. I am actually going to use our original pattern I took the original printed pattern and copied it without seam allowance to a piece of oak tag so that I can reuse this for future projects. I put a notch down here where my tailor's tack would go. As you can see, there's no seam allowance added along this edge because that's the edge that we serged. It doesn't sew onto anything. But I did add there is seam allowance on your pattern at the waistline and along here because we had to sew this into the crotch curve in order to to install the facing, and we have to leave some seam allowance at the top here from when we install a waistband. We're not installing a waistband on this sample, but we need that there for actual garments. So I've copied this onto oak tag, and I can use this to mark out my J-fly curve. What you want to do when you're marking this is to feel your sample and feel for the end of your zipper. You should feel a little bump where the metallic end of your zipper is hiding underneath here. I can't get to it right now because everything is stitched down, but you still have those little metal prongs here on the wrong side of the zipper. And if you lay this down flat and you should feel a little hard bump down here near that tailor's tack. That's the end of your zipper. You do not want to sew over that. It's metal. It will break your needle. It'll possibly mess up your machine. You really don't want to sew over that. So I'm going to feel for that little metal piece. It's a small rectangle of metal. And I want to start sketching. I'm going to mark below that piece of metal. I want to go underneath that piece of metal. So my zipper stop, I'm going to sketch it out here on my fabric, is sitting right about here. I can feel it through my fabric. It's this little terribly drawn rectangle right here, and I'm making a mark just below it so that I don't accidentally stitch that. And now I'll use my oak tag sloper to mark out my curve, my J-fly curve. What's important when you're marking this, and I do highly recommend that you hand base this in place just to make sure that everything matches up properly. You want to make sure that you're catching, I'm actually going to redraw that. I can see where my serge stitching is underneath here, but if you're using a binding or something like that and it's hard to see where the end of your facing is, you're going to want to put some pins or hand stitch through it from the inside. Because you want to make sure when you sew this J-fly, this top stitch, you want to make sure you catch the facing underneath. So if you make it too wide, we're not going to catch the fly. We can make it narrower than necessary, but we don't want to make it too wide or we're not going to catch the J-fly. I can see my serge stitching underneath here, and I can see that it's curving up in this direction. So I'm going to make this a little narrower. There we go. That should, because if I stitched out here, I might miss a little bit of the edge here, but stitching here gives me plenty of space for where that serge stitching is underneath on my facing. I'm going to pin this and take it to the machine. It's important that when you go to sew this top stitch, that you start from the crotch curve seam and work your way up into the waistline. I'm going to put my needle down here, starting at the crotch curve seam, and then I will stitch along that line all the way up to my waistline. It's very important that you stitch it in that direction, because if for something things don't line up properly or things aren't properly pinned, or you've got some pieces that are kind of shifting on you, or you're working with a fabric that likes to slip and slide, if you start from the waistline and stitch your way down, you run the risk of getting bunching down here in the crotch. And then you got to rip out all the stitching and redo it. So you may as well, if there's something that's going to go wrong, we may as well push all the excess up into the waistline, into this seam allowance where nobody's going to see it once you apply a waistband. So I'm going to take it to my machine. I'll start here and stitch my way up. switching back to my regular foot. I'm going to make sure I have some tails on my thread because I'm going to end up tying those in a knot when I'm finished. Place my sample in here, again starting down here at that crotch curve. Gonna lower my needle right into that crotch seam, if I could see it. I do not recommend back tacking at this point. I'm just gonna stitch straight along, and I'm gonna utilize tying my threads to secure my ends. I'm not going to back tack. Take it slow. Take your time as you go around this curve. Lock your stitches if need be. Top stitching is a very delicate process. It's not great. If this were an actual garment, I would probably redo this because it got a little bit of a corner here that I'm not happy about, but it's just a sample. I'm going to check on the other side just to make sure that I've actually sewn through my facing. I can see that I've caught my facing here, so that's looking good. And as I mentioned before, I'm going to utilize these thread tails. I'm actually going to go to the inside, the wrong side of the garment, because I don't want any knots showing on the right side of the garment. Make sure that everything's looking nice and flat here. You shouldn't have any pieces overlapping or bunching or doing any weird things. We should have the zipper relatively flat down here. This seam should be relatively flat. We did not press that seam open, but it should be flat. I'm going to tug on my thread here and pick up the loop of thread that it carries with it. Whoops. All right, there it is. My thread's got a little bit knotted up in here. I see what happened. There we go. My thread's got a little knotted up over here on the back side, but we are good to go. Tie 2 or 3 square knots. Clip them, leaving tiny little tails. Here's the inside of my J-fly. Here's the outside. I'm going to press this really quickly to get rid of these marks. So this is my completed J-fly. I would take a photo of this for your process just to show that you did whip stitch the center front together. I'm going to go ahead and remove this basing stitch. If you were working on a full garment, you could leave the basting stitches in until you go to install the waistband. But just so we can see how this is going to look and how it will function, I'm going to remove these stitches for now. So from the front, looks completely unassuming. I can tug the two pieces apart. And if I didn't have black stitching, I used black thread for demonstration purposes so you could see it. But if I had white thread, it would probably be less noticeable. I can tug the two ends apart. Nothing's going to come loose, which looks fine. And we should see this raw edge flow smoothly into our crotch curve seam, because there's my crotch curve seam right in there. It should be a nice smooth transition. We shouldn't have too much bunching. We shouldn't have things shifting around or anything. It should be a nice, relatively smooth transition. And if I lift this up, you can see there is my zipper fully installed. It's in there. It's not going anywhere. It's stitched to one side and it's stitched into the fly on the other side. And I can open this up to have access. Now, this is the basis for our J-fly. But if you're wearing an actual piece of trousers, you'll notice that once you open this up, everyone can see all your business. So that leaves our last piece, our guard. The one that we made first is actually the thing that we install last. The edge that's still open here at the top, this will go to my waistline edge, and the edge that's closed down here will go down into the pant. I'm going to slide this underneath. My serged edge of my guard will go along this edge here. Now you know why we have this extra extension on our seam allowance. It's to allow us to install the guard and have plenty of seam allowance to do so. So I'm going, just so you can see what it will look like when it's sewn into place, this will slide down into here and stitch to that seam allowance that's loose, so that when you unzip the pants, you have a little bit of modesty on the inside. The guard serves as a means for, it's a couple of purposes. One, for modesty, so when you unzip the pant, you don't have access, people can't see all of your business. It's also there to protect the body from the teeth of the zipper, especially if you're wearing like a metal zipper or something on a pair of jeans. This may not be the most comfortable thing to feel up against the skin. So the guard acts as a guard between the zipper and the body. It also serves as an extension. So when you go to install your waistband, and as it states in the textbook, you add an 1.25" extension. That is this 1.25". So you install your waistband from the center back all the way around the side seam to center front. This is your extension. This is your center front where this edge finishes on this facing. But this is also your center front here. And now you've got an extra 1.25" according to this pattern. It will differ depending on what kind of pattern you're using. There's an extra 1.25" here, which is your extension. And we want that extension so that when we close this, we have our waistband overlapping. This side will overlap this side, so we have space to put a button and a buttonhole. So this serves as your button extension, and you would install your buttonhole to this side of your waistband. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this over so I can zip up. I'm going to zip that up. I'm going to turn the whole thing over to the inside where all the threads and guts are. I'm going to take my guard again. Serged edge is going to go along this seam allowance. I'm just going to line it up against the raw edges here. And it should match down at the bottom. It should cover up the zipper and all the ugly stuff going on underneath there. You can sew this. Wait, let me leave this flat for right now. You can sew this just through the extension. That'll be perfectly fine. I'm going to do 2 lines of stitching. I'll sew it just to the extension first, and then I'll sew it again a little bit further in so I catch the zipper, so that when I open this, it doesn't expose the zipper and all this zipper tape and whatnot. So I'm going to line this up. I'm just going to grab the seam allowance and my guard. I'm going to put a few pins in here. Now when I go to the machine, I'm going to turn it this way so that I can see my seam allowance. And I'll stitch, again, I'll stitch once close to the edge. I'll probably stitch once close to the zipper and then again close to the edge just to secure it so it doesn't go anywhere. I'm just going to pin it from this side because it'll be easier for me to remove these pins while I'm sewing. Let me go do that. Again, just sewing through the guard, the zipper, tape, and the extension here. I can use this foot. You can use the standard foot if you're working on the industrial machines. Those feet are narrow enough. But since I'm working on my home machine, I'm going to switch back to my zipper foot just so I can get close to this folded edge. I don't want to sew through the fold, but I can see where my zipper tape is, and I want to make sure that I'm stitching pretty close to that so I catch the zipper tape. And one more line of stitching for security. So there is the J-fly from the front of the garment. Again, these tails can be cut off as long as you're using a polyester or nylon coil zipper. There goes my zip all the way down to the bottom. There's our guard to protect any mishaps so no one can see into what's beyond, and so that we protect the body from the zipper itself. And here's the inside, the guard sewn in place. Now this is still open, and I want you to leave this open for sample purposes so you can lift this up and take photos of your construction on the inside as well. But in an actual garment, especially things like denim, you might see these sewn together. Now for a typical garment, you would take your guard and what little bit of facing you have, pinch these two together and put some stitching through here. You may just do like a bit of a top stitch, you know, 3 or 4 stitches and back tack just to hold it in place. Or you'll see a bar tack that'll be put in here. It's just a line of zigzag stitching to hold this together so that this doesn't fly open when somebody is unzipping the pants. So you'll usually have the guard and the facing stitched together, which is another reason why we have such a long seam allowance down here on the facing, so you have a little bit of extra to connect to the guard. On denim, jeans and whatnot, you'll see that bar tack extend all the way to the front of the pant. You'll usually see a bar tack here, which will hold everything together, and you might see another bar tack here along the top stitching. That's to hold the pant, the facing underneath, and the guard into place so that that doesn't come loose. You're welcome to experiment with that, but for the sake of the sample, keep the guard loose so that you can pull this away and photograph the inside. So I do want to see a photograph of the front with the zipper closed. I want to see a photograph of the front with the zipper open and pulled apart so I can see that you have your guard properly installed. I want to see a photo of the back, just like this, and a photo with this pulled aside. So I want to see your basting stitches. You should be able to see those. I've still got mine in there, so make sure you're using a contrast thread. I should see 2 lines of stitching where you did your first line of stitching to the zipper and your second line, your top stitching to hold it in place. I should see a line of stitching here where you sewed your zipper to your facing, and I should see a bit of stitching here where you've got your J-fly sewn together. And I should see stitching here, and if you're using a matching thread of serge thread, I should see 2 lines of stitching here. You can see a bit of mine is here. The rest is flowing into the serge stitching. And now you've done your J-fly. The next thing we'll work on is adding the pockets.